All right. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for the BAKKHAI Variations Composite Experience, is what we're calling it here around Villanova Theater. My name is Zach Apony. I use they, them pronouns, and I was the production dramaturg for this whole operation.
And my name is James Ijames, and I am the director of two of the pieces. I directed She Makes Knives Now and Beginning, and I also served as supervising director, and I use he, him pronouns.
And the two of us are just kind of have to, we're going to have a conversation, a retrospective about this whole process, what brought us to this point, what did we learn, what are we still curious about, those sorts of things. And so I guess I've asked this question to quite a few folks, around Villanova Theater, but I'd really be curious, James, to hear your perspective on what brought us to BAKKHAI originally. For those who may not know, we planned to do Anne Carson's BAKKHAI, which you might have saw the reading of that Heidi Rose directed. What brought us to the story of BAKKHAI, and what brought us to Anne Carson's version in particular is kind of our first topic.
And I guess I could talk about that in two different waves. I came across the Anne Carson maybe 2 years ago or a year and a half ago, and just read it, for my own enjoyment, because I read plays the way most people read like magazines, and really loved it, and was like, oh, if I ever do the BAKKHAI, I think this is the one that I would want to do. And this past academic year, we structured our season selection at Villanova as a town hall, at least in the beginning, so that we could get maximum impact from the whole community, not just the faculty and the staff, but also the students. And I believe in one of the groups that I was in, or the group that I was in, the BAKKHAI was one of the plays on the table, and someone else had put it on the table. So I was like, oh, so I think our community is also interested in this story. But then as we began to talk about it as something that could fit into the whole season, I began to think of it as this real conversation between these polar sort of impulses that I think exist in most societies, of like reason and like abandon, or the head versus the heart, or the hunger, if you will. I think the hunger is probably more accurate in the case of the BAKKHAI. And I felt like if I wanted to work on this play, I wanted to sort of dismantle this false dichotomy that one of those things is good and one of those things is inherently not just bad but evil. That a connection to the earth, connection to one's body, a connection to one's just desire, pleasure, hunger, need, all of those things are attributes that I think people connect with, like human frailty or human weakness even. And I want to sort of explore, like, well, is that true? Is that real? And also, is it just a foregone conclusion that reason, this the worship of history, or how history has been taken down, or who gets to take down history, or who gets to decide what laws are, the rationale of things, making things appear rational even though if they don't seem to make any sense. Like, I'm sure there's a rationale why billionaires are not taxed in the same way that poor people are taxed. I'm sure someone has come up with a rationale of that. I'm sure someone would say this is reasonable. And so we just accept it. So I felt like the play offered an opportunity for me to be curious about those things and connect that to something, or a story that's very old, making the case that this is something that we've been grappling with and considering and thinking about for a very long time. So I think that's, for me, that was what was interesting. And then that sort of was what made the play interesting at this moment in time to explore as a piece of dramatic literature. And then, you know, it's a fabulous translation. Like what I love about the translation is that it's a poet. So it still has it's not a translator. I mean, yes, there is a translator involved, but like the way it is committed to the page is from the poetic space, which I felt like made it feel both very contemporary and also really authentic to like the way I imagine the play exists in the Greek.
Yeah, there's a lot in what you just said that was really brilliant, James. The thing I wanna latch onto first is like those false binaries. Like I feel like we as a culture are really grappling with like the false binaries that exist, and I feel like this one, you know, what you know Nietzsche called the Apollonian, the Dionysian, like those different sides of us. Is something we've been grappling with for a really long time, and like this play is very complicated about it, and like I think that's one of the big reasons people come back to the Greeks, is because it wasn't a play with like tidy answers. They were plays that presented complex situations and didn't come down like a, and that's exactly how you do it, especially Euripides, who wrote the original Bacchae. Was very fond of the gray area, and yet, you know, people like, as the dramaturg, I looked a lot at the production history and how the story has been treated, and there was a really long period where essentially there were no restagings of Bacchae, and I think during that time those binaries became a little more solid, and like the idea of making them complex, the idea of they're not, as you're saying, being a right or wrong, um, like dissolving that binary became really unpopular, and it really wasn't until like the 60s and 1960s that it became popular to kind of take that up again.
And doesn't
So
that
yeah,
make
I
so
think
much
that's different.
sense? That
Of
makes so
course, when
much
else would
sense.
it have been?
It's like the moment at least in American history, but I think this is probably true in many parts of the world, where we start to like shed this like idea um, of ideal and not ideal. I'll use that language. Um, you know, the just assuming things are inherently good because someone told you that they are, as opposed to investigating what they mean for you. Yeah. Yeah. Wow, that's when it came back. That's when people started doing again in the 60s.
Yeah, I mean, there were so like the first translation was in the like 19 aughts. It was like 1908, and then it was produced in like 1911 or something like that. Um, so, and that's like, but like it literally, like many of them had like many of the Greek tragedies, I mean, had operas and translations into English and various different languages, like during even the Middle Ages, and into the Renaissance. And Bacchae was like a late entry into that because it like didn't comport with the ideas that like Europe had kind of stolen from Greece. Like there's this whole idea of like drawing our lineage back to Greece, us being, you know, like white Europeans. Even though the Greeks didn't consider themselves particularly white, but that's a whole different issue. But yeah, I think lots of the Greek tragedies were very, very popular stories, and this one didn't quite grab them. And I think it's because it's so messy, it's so complicated, and because like the like ferocity of the Bacchae just like didn't fit into the idea of like the Greek values that they were purporting. And so yeah, like the early 20th century, like there were a few productions here and there, mostly at like universities and stuff, but really it wasn't until the 60s that specifically Black artists, but also famously Dionysus in 69 brought it back. And I feel like Carson really kind of, to me, as one of like the I wouldn't call it the pinnacle, that doesn't quite make sense, but like a really amazing kind of result of all of that conversation, because it is interested in these complex ideas, and it is interested in the artificiality and the theatricality of this story, as well as the very like deep humanity inside of it, and holding those things at the same time is really, really difficult. And I think Carson does a really beautiful job of it.
She does. It's a beautiful translation.
Yeah, can't recommend enough. A big thing that's come up for a lot of people is her translator's note, which she also writes kind of in a kind of a free poetic form that I would highly recommend. If you got a chance to see the reading, it was actually read at the beginning of the reading by the director, Dr. Heidi Rose. So that was just like another part of it that just made it add a lot of context for our playwrights for the variations, which is kind of my next topic of like bringing it forward to BAKKHAI variations. If we started with Anne Carson, what brought us to this, other than the obvious of like, you know, we couldn't do theater safely, you know, in one space with like an audience and on stage and the way that we would have wanted, but what else like made these particular stories, these particular variations really exciting and relevant to Villanova? Because I know, James, from personal experience, you were really excited to get into these stories. So I wonder if you could speak to that.
Well, I actually want to take it back to the decision to commission the playwrights, because I think that comes out of a real desire among specifically the faculty and the staff over the summer to try to help people who had lost work. And we were like, well, if we commission, you know, we could have commissioned one person to do something, but we commissioned 5 people because we wanted to give some folks some income. And at that point, we didn't know what anything was going to be looking like. So we were like, this is a great sort of safety net as well. And so those 5 alumni wrote really spectacular plays, as you have just seen. And it started to become really obvious to me that like, well, that's that beautiful heart work that everybody had done on these plays. I really wanted people to have those experiences. And they had done such a great job of like taking the themes of the play and bringing them really, really, really into the present tense. Like they feel like very contemporary conversations about exile and what does it mean to be alone, which is fabulous to think about right now. Like so many people are really grappling with it. And I think in this moment, as we move into winter, that's going to even become more of an intense experience for people. Thinking about what it means to be an outsider and what it means to be someone who's different and how people treat you in that respect. They just made the plays, each of the plays felt really, really fresh and contemporary, and they just were really well written. And so I knew that I suddenly felt like I really wanted to do them, but I didn't think I could do them all myself because that seems insane. And being on the other side of it, I don't think I could have. There was one point where I was thinking about doing 3, and I'm glad I didn't do that. Because they're just so big. Each one is like really, really full of ideas and possibilities of how to make them. And they're written for a platform that, you know, has some liveness to it, but is not what we're used to in terms of what we think about theater. And I mean, I know we're probably going to talk about this later, but I have a couple of different feelings about how theater functions in this moment where we can't be in a theater together. And is it still theater? And I think my mood about that changes depending on the weather.
Yeah, that's very real. Yeah, we'll dig more into that, but I really want to go back and kind of talk about like these plays, because something that really fascinated me is, so like during undergraduate, I studied ancient Greek and Greek tragedy quite a bit. So this, you know, coming out of this project almost felt like coming home. And also I really like almost fell in love with Dionysus through this process, because a question I was often asking myself as dramaturg to the various creative teams for the 5 pieces was like, what about Dionysus are we exploring? Because this, like, the thing that I say, and like this isn't like 100% true, like all of the various gods are ancient Greek gods and goddesses are complicated, right? They're all they all have things going on in their own stories. But I think of Dionysus as particularly complicated, where like a lot of, you know, for Aphrodite, you could say the god of love, or, you know, Ares, the god of war, but like Dionysus is the god of like wine and like just like generally the harvest of wet fruit is like actually how they, like there was like a Greek word for like wet fruit, like not just grapes but also like olives. um and but also theater and like this like abandoning these rituals, and like it was also really like his ritual spaces were like really welcoming to marginalized people, like slaves and like non-Greeks were welcome to these ritual spaces. And so he's like such a complicated deity, and like like all that stuff about like gender is like absolutely there. Like that is not a presentism. Like one of his like epithets, and he has dozens, is androgynous, because literally he had the power to alter his physiology and his presentation. And like that's like right there, like in the Greek myth. And all of that stuff is so rife and so interesting. And I feel like each of these plays explores like a facet of that, like an idea of this very complex deity. And so I feel like seeing them all together, you kind of get this like really interesting picture of Dionysus as like as a multifaceted figure. So that was like one particular thing. There's a lot that I obviously really love digging into, but that's like an overarching thing I wanted to make sure we touched on.
Totally. I think the other thing about Dionysus, you know, I think there's a real connection between um I like that wet fruit. Like fruit, you know, things that can be um sort of transformed into uh they can be transformed. One, they can be like made into something else. So it's not just, that's not the end of the story, is that the grape comes off the vine and then you consume it. Like, yes, you can do that, but then it also can be, you know, made into wine, which is, you know, one of the major things. So it has inherent in Dionysus is this notion that, you know, there's an inherent good in transformation, in becoming the many facets of what you can be and what you are, which is also true in the theater, right? That's actually the work of the theater, is this this real belief in transformation and truth. Like, you know, in, you know, what's the saying? In wine there's truth, or something like that.
In Vino
In vino
Veritas.
veritas, that's it. You know, so like, you know, the old folks back home say like, a drunk mind speaks a sober tongue. Like there's
Mm,
something about truth, and the truth that we're always trying to like get at in the theater. If you're good at what you're doing, you're trying to get it to like a kind of truth about a moment. um and like even back then, we're sort of like acknowledging that those two things are very connected. um that the freedom of the mind and the body, in a way, and the transformation, all of those things are really like tied together to like a quest for something that feels really true. um and I think all these plays do that. Like they took
yeah.
this raw material of the Bacchae, this wet fruit of a play, and they made wine and olive oil, and, you know, and then splattered it all over the place and had a great time. I just love it.
Yeah, it's so good. Yeah, I feel like if I had to, which I don't, but if I had to say Dionysus is like the god of something, I would probably say the god of transformation or the god of communion. Like
Mm,
these really complex ideas held in this single deity who is like older, like in terms of actual like practice and worship, like older than basically all of the gods that you might think of as ancient Greek gods and goddesses, maybe with the exception of Zeus. Um, you know, I think this is also mentioned in the Anne Carson translation that there are like 12th century BCE linear B tablets, like those really like old stone tablets with that really like old fashioned looking script that like is like a mix between like an alphabet and hieroglyphics. And we found the root word for Dionysus in one of those that's so ancient. And and also practiced all over like that part of the world, like across Southwest Asia and North Africa and across the Mediterranean. There's evidence of worshiping a figure a lot like Dionysus. And so, yeah, it was really great to spend so much time with this figure for this project, because I think so many of those ideas are still relevant to us, like the things you're talking about, James.
Yeah, for sure.
But to bring us into the stuff you were kind of leading us into with this whole like Zoom theater, digital theater, you know, COVID theater, like whatever you want to call it, like it's such like an emerging art form. Because like, sure, we've done, you know, we've recorded things before, like on stage. You know, pretty much everyone watched Hamilton on Disney Plus. But there's something particular about the inventiveness and the innovations that and like the risks that we're taking and kind of exploring this hybridization of theater and film. And so I'm curious, like thinking about this as a retrospective, like what did we learn, and what are we still curious about in terms of this style of doing theater, if it is truly theater at all?
Right. I think it is theater. I think I've come out of, because this, you know, before this, I've done a radio play, and I've helped, you know, put together the planning for other things in the future. So like I've been dealing with what this means for a while. I think what it does, just on a structural level, the idea that a play is now suddenly available to anyone who can log on to a computer is powerful. And is, I just think about the person I was when I was like 14 years old in a small town that had a community theater, but like it wasn't like, there wasn't theater, you know. And I remember going to PBS, and occasionally they would have like a play, like there would be a play on PBS, and thinking, oh, this is different from a movie. This is not the same thing. One, movies aren't wordy. Movies aren't about language, they're about image. So instantly we have to like grapple with storytelling that is about the words, which is about the text primarily. And then how do you then make that visually interesting and narrative enough that those two things are working together and not discordant. So that makes it feel like theater to me in a way that like going to watch like you know, the film adaptation of Streetcar Named Desire, which is a, you know, flawed but ultimately successful film. It's not the same as, you know, seeing a production of Streetcar filmed in a theater. It's just a very different experience. So yeah, I think that's the thing I've sort of waffled back and forth on. And at the moment, I'm very much like, yeah, we should be making content that is digital, using whatever platforms we have at our disposal to try to make theater, because it does reach people who don't. I mean, I think that's the next step. And I mean, how do we get people to choose to see something that's got some liveness to it versus something that's like on Netflix? And I think that's possible too. I mean, yeah, I'm just curious about how it makes theater going not elitist, not something that's specifically for people who have a great deal of wealth, or people who live near a major city, or people who you know, have access to Broadway. You know, they can take a trip for a weekend and go see 5 plays in New York. Like that's that's a very specific demographic. And so I would love for this moment, and I think it's already starting to begin, to be a space in which we can imagine ways in which to bring more people um, into the forum, both, you know, in the making of it, but also as audience members. And I also think we're like in this weird moment, weird relationship to theatricality. You know, we've we are still in the midst of massive national and global protest for many, many different things. Um, and the tools of that work, a lot of those tools are the same tools as the theater. You know, we're in the middle of a major political contest. That's the language I'll use. And that is a kind of theater as well. So, you know, we're all watching these things, and there's also a ton of theater content in the world, and people are like using Zoom, and we're like, whoa, I didn't know you could do that with Zoom. It's forcing, and I use this term force with a lot of love and a lot of compassion, it's forcing us to not try to circumvent and work around the realities of the fact that we cannot be together, and is really forcing us to confront what it means to be apart and trying to be together, which I think is an interesting impulse as well. We're lucky, like, I mean, I can't imagine what the last pandemic would have been like, where you just can't see people. Like, we're lucky that I can sit on this call and have a conversation with you who I haven't seen. I think I'm just realizing the first time I saw you was when we were in the field doing the drone shot, and it was so
Yeah.
surreal because I was like, I haven't seen them since March. That is, it was like really, really surreal. And so that was a special interaction. So I can't wait for the moment where it's just like, hey, we're all but the trying to be together, the trying to find the ways to share space, to share ideas, I think is going to create more and more creativity in terms of what theater looks like, both in these platforms, but also when we come back into the buildings. I feel like I just like talked a lot about that. I have a lot of feelings about it.
I could tell they're all brilliant. The big thing, like, and I keep saying this, is like, I am determined, and I strongly, strongly believe that this whole digital theater thing is not going to go away the second we can safely gather in buildings. Like, I think it's here to stay because of all the things you're talking about in terms of accessibility, but also, like, sometimes I have the feelings that it is its own particular experience. There's something nice about having access to it, not just for like the people who like don't want to interact with like the elitist auspices of a theater building, which is something that the theater world is definitely grappling with, but also being able to just simply experience it at home. There's like, it almost begets a different type of intimacy. Intimacy was like a big watchword for me this time, and I feel like that, like, relationship to the camera and relationship to like how you view the audience and like how you are bringing them into liveness, like, is a big thing of like how I think of distinguish these from film in terms of theater. Like, I feel like I it's not a joke because it's a very real thing. Most times people's most memorable theater experiences as opposed to film experiences are when you kind of see the wires, when something doesn't quite go right, or you can kind of tell like, oh, I understand how that effect worked and now I'm in on it. Like, bringing people in on it is not something, it's something film can do, but it's not something film tends to do, and it's not like the normal film toolkit. And so I think that's something I think we'll continue to explore, is like, how can we, despite the boundary of space and the camera and all of that, still bring our audiences in on experiencing this with us, because that's what it is, right? We are experiencing it together. That is like the essence of theater. So I'm very curious to see how those tools are going to continue to evolve. But I think even these 5 shows like accomplish that idea in a very, very different ways, and like shows that like there isn't like a way, like we're not going to end up in like, this is how you do digital theater, because we don't have that for non-digital theater. Like there's no one way to do it, but I think it shows that we still have a lot of space and conversations still to have. So James and I are not going to solve this question for you tonight. I'm sorry.
Not tonight.
call us a few months. Yeah, I guess like, are there any other thoughts you have about any of this, any of these larger questions, things that you want to make sure people are thinking about and musing about the variations?
Not that I can think of. I mean, what's interesting about, just to go back to the Greeks, and I promise this will get to a point, I promise,
Yeah.
that they're one of the first societies to decide to make the beings that they worship basically versions of themselves. And I think there's a real correlation between that and this moment that we're in now with our relationship to technology, where basically technology, the only thing technology can really do for us is like mirror back to us all of the things that we put into it. Like there's a real, I think, similarity between those inventions in humanity, which is, I think the good thing in it is the recognition of us as being a part of something bigger and included in something bigger, and not like in opposition to something bigger. I think that that's very real. The thing that's maybe like dangerous about that is the assumption that I as an individual can make a decision about what's good for so many people, as opposed to thinking, it's really difficult to think in the collective, and to be thinking with people as opposed to like thinking for yourself. This is what I want, this is who I am, this is what I need, and I don't really care what anybody else needs. And so I'm hoping that a digital play is a thing that sort of like makes you sort of go here with your phone or your laptop and have the experience of the storytelling, but that it also like inspires you to want to like then go and like connect with people, as opposed to just staying in the like, what was my unique experience? Like what the great thing about the theater is that you have this horizontal experience in the audience that's happening along with each individual's vertical experience of like, what's happening on stage? I'm watching it, I have these feelings, but I also see the woman sitting beside me who's weeping and I'm not weeping. And what does that mean? What does it say about me? Oh, is she okay? It does this thing that goes this way that's really beautiful. And I don't want to lose that in the shifting. So I think that's the next big step, I think, for these platforms, is to find the way that the singular experience of watching something doesn't erase the communal collective experience of having someone else's watching change how you watch something. And that happens in a lot of spaces. I mean, that happens in church, that happens in the grocery store. The number of times I've seen someone pick something up and I'm like, oh, that's a good idea. It's the same thing. We just don't see it or think about it in that way, but it is like really, truly being in conversation with your fellow man, not out of necessity, but out of, well, yeah, maybe it is out of necessity. I need to be connected. Yeah. Okay. Enough.
Yeah. No, I so strongly agree. And like, as a emerging scholar, specifically interested in like theater history and like thinking about theater history very globally, I'm so drawn to like just this big question of like embodied storytelling, right? Like lots and lots and lots of cultures, independent of influence from others, have come to this, like, we need to get up and perform something together with like, not just like me by myself, not just me with my friends, but for the community, right?
Yeah.
And like that is like, I don't want to say universal because that makes it sound like every single person has to have this feeling, but it is a widespread phenomenon. And I think it really taps into what you're talking about, that horizontal and vertical experience, but also just like, I just think a lot of it taps a lot into the ideas of BAKKHAI. Like so much of it is about being seen and seeing being seen. Right? Like so much of those ideas, and that's like I think what I love so much about like I want to be clear, as far as we can tell, it's the only play we have on record. Sorry, it's the only tragedy we have on record. There is a comedy that does this. It's the only tragedy we have on record that features Dionysus, the god that they were currently at a festival worshiping, as a character. And like all of the things that does about like analyzing how we interact in communion with one another is it's all so present to me, and very relevant to all the things you're talking about how to keep that communion still alive despite the physical distance that we have to keep for our own health and safety. Yeah, and I'm sure there are tech people in theater right now tapping away on keyboards, making apps so that you can, I don't know, like have the like piece playing out on your TV, but on your phone have like an audience interaction tool or something like that. Like I'm sure those ideas are floating around, and you know, even the simple ways to make something like Zoom more compatible has evolved while like during this process. So I think the technology is only going to improve, as you say, out of necessity.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a good note to end on, unless you have other things, James.
No, this was great.
Yeah, thank you, James, for joining me and chatting with me. It's always a pleasure, and thank you, audiences at home, for hanging out with us. I hope this little conversation retrospective, whatever you want to call it, talk back, well, just talking really, has elucidated some things for you, and I hope you enjoyed the experience of the BAKKHAI variations. Thanks so much.
Bye.
Bye.